Hello, Nightstalkers. You're just in time for a story. Tonight, we're trying something a little bit different. Imagine your favorite horror games, but not as gameplay, but as a chilling tale that stays with you long after the screen goes dark. This evening, we'll explore the Mortuary Assistant, but not as a walkthrough. Instead, you'll hear it as a macabre retelling crafted into a story that's sure to crawl under your skin. So join in, dim the lights, as we step into Rebecca's first night shift. (1998) Connecticut, the diner. A thin layer of dew coated the diner windows, the faint glow of neon lights reflecting off the streaked glass. The air inside was warm, filled with the scent of sizzling bacon and freshly brewed coffee. Rebecca sat across from her grandmother, their booth tucked in the center of the bustling eatery. The creak of vinyl seats accompanied every shift of their bodies, a subtle reminder of the years etched into this place. Grandma's voice cut through the noise, carrying that familiar blend of disapproval and affection. "I'll never understand why you chose such a macabre field," she said, her wrinkled hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee. Rebecca braced herself, but Grandma's expression softened, her tone shifting. "But I'm proud of you. I really am. You've come so far." Rebecca lowered her defenses, the tension in her shoulders easing as her grandmother's pride momentarily outweighed her reservations. Still, Grandma wasn't finished. "You haven't told me what's next. Will you get a job where you are on?" Rebecca hesitated, the air between them growing heavy. She shifted uncomfortably, her gaze dropping to the chipped diner tabletop. "They already have everyone they need, but my old teacher, Mr. Delver, offered to let me finish my internship in his office." She paused, her voice dropping as she added, "Riverfields Mortuary." Grandma froze, the mug trembling slightly in her grasp. Her disapproval returned like a shadow creeping over her features. "Oh, Rebecca, I don't like that." Rebecca leaned forward, her voice firm but tinged with unease. "People make up stories, Grandma. Death is scary to a lot of people, but that doesn't mean anything strange is happening there. No one's embalming ghost bodies or whatever. It's fine." Grandma's frown deepened as she reached in her coat pocket, pulling out a small cross on a delicate chain. She placed it on the table between them. The cross glinted under the flickering overhead lights, its presence commanding attention. Rebecca's throat tightened as she stared at the necklace. I don't know if I want that," Rebecca said, hesitating. "Take it," Grandma said softly. "It should be yours anyway." Rebecca reluctantly pocketed the necklace, mumbling a quick thanks. The tension lingered, though the conversation shifted back to lighter topics. Rebecca eventually revealed that she had already been working at the mortuary for weeks, her final review scheduled for the next day. As she spoke, the wail of a passing ambulance siren filled the diner, drowning out her last words. Next day, the mortuary. The mortuary loomed against the gray sky, its dark facade broken only by the flicker of a faulty porch light. Rebecca parked her car and took a deep breath, the engine ticking softly as it cooled. "All right," she whispered to herself. "Here we go." The bell above the mortuary door jingled as she stepped inside, the sound reverberating in the hollow stillness. The reception desk was empty, a single document taped to the hallway door catching her eye. A yellow sticky note read, "Rebecca, one last thing I forgot to give you. Please grab a pencil from my desk and sign. Thanks, Zoe. P.S. Good luck." Rebecca grabbed the pencil, signed the document, and pushed open the door. The air beyond was noticeably colder, carrying a faint metallic tang. In the embalming room, a pale figure lay on a gurney under the harsh fluorescent lights. The man's lifeless eyes stared upward, unblinking, his skin tinged with the sickly hue of death. "Rebecca! Great! Perfect timing!" Mr. Delver's booming voice startled her. He emerged from behind the desk, his expression calm, almost too calm. He gestured to the body. "This is Mr. Dalton. I just finished with him. Can you take him to cold storage and bring out Mrs. Page?" Rebecca nodded, the gurney's wheels squeaking as she moved it down the dimly lit hallway. The cold storage unit hummed ominously, its heavy doors lined up like a row of silent sentinels. She slid Mr. Dalton into his designated space, ensuring the door latched securely before retrieving Mrs. Page. Rebecca returned to the embalming room, the gurney creaking under Mrs. Page's weight. Her skin was pallid and waxy, her eyes milky white, staring blankly into nothingness. "All right, Rebecca," Mr. Delver said, settling back at his desk. "Grab the clipboard and start recording identifying marks." Rebecca picked up the clipboard, the cool metal smooth against her fingertips. Her movement slowed as she approached Mrs. Page's lifeless form, the fluorescent lights casting sharp shadows across her features. The faint scent of disinfectant and decay filled the room as Rebecca began her inspection. Rebecca leaned closer, her breath hitching as Mrs. Page's glossy eyes seemed to follow her every move. Suddenly, the embalming room's large window slammed shut with a deafening crash. Rebecca jumped, the clipboard slipping from her grasp and clattering to the floor. "Oh, these old windows," Mr. Delver said, dismissively, not even looking up. "They never stay latched." Rebecca's heart raced as she retrieved the clipboard. She finished documenting the marks, her hands trembling slightly as she filled in the record system at the desk. As the printer spat out the final report, a faint voice whispered from behind her, "You'll die here." Rebecca froze. The words were barely audible, like a breath against the nape of her neck. She turned sharply to Mr. Delver, her voice unsteady. "What was that?" Mr. Delver raised an eyebrow, his expression neutral. "I didn't say anything. Are you feeling alright?" Rebecca nodded, and quickly brushing off her unease, Yeah, I'm fine." But the whisper lingered in her mind. With Mr. Delver watching over her shoulder, Rebecca began the embalming process. She placed the needle injector against Mrs. Page's jaw, the soft click of the mechanism puncturing the silence as she wired it shut. The eye caps came next, their smooth plastic edges cold against her fingertips as she carefully placed them over Mrs. Page's lifeless eyes. The embalming fluid was next. Rebecca moved to the shelf, collecting bottles of chemicals and arranging them on the counter. Just as she reached for the final bottle, the entire shelf shook violently, sending bottles crashing to the floor. The sharp sound echoed through the room, and Rebecca stumbled back, staring at the scattered glass and pooling liquid. Mr. Delver's voice cut through her shock. "Sometimes they aren't stored properly. Pressure builds up and it can make them pop like that." His calm demeanor was unnerving, as if he had rehearsed his explanation countless times before. Rebecca hesitated, but eventually nodded. gathering the remaining bottles and mixing the fluids in the embalming tank. The faint gurgle of the machine filled the room as the liquid swirled together. Taking the scalpel, she made an incision in Mrs. Page's neck, the blade slicing cleanly through the cold flesh. The forceps clicked into place, and she connected the PVC tubing to the embalming machine. The pumps roared to life, the rhythmic wiring accompanied by the faint trickle of blood draining from the body. Rebecca kept her focus, each step methodical, until the process was complete. She removed the tubing, wiped the incision clean, and prepared to moisturize Mrs. Page's face. As she wiped the pale skin, Mrs. Page's head suddenly jerked toward her, the face twisting into a grotesque grimace. The decomposed skin peeled back, revealing hollow eye sockets and a mouth frozen mid-scream. Rebecca stumbled back, her breath caught in her throat. "Rebecca," Mr. Delver's calm voice jolted her back to reality. He stood by the window, his shadow stretching across the room. "Why don't you head out for the day? I'll finish up here." Rebecca blinked, the horrifying vision gone. Mrs. Page lay motionless once more, her face serene and unchanging. "I'm fine," she protested weakly. "Don't worry, you're doing great," Mr. Delver reassured her. "Go home, get some rest. I'll call you for your first shift." Rebecca reluctantly agreed, leaving the embalming room with her nerves frayed. The bell above the front door jingled faintly as she stepped out into the fading daylight. Rebecca's apartment. Rebecca sat cross-legged on her couch, the dim light of a single lamp casting shadows across her cluttered apartment. Her phone rested on her lap, her fingers idly tracing its edges as she talked to her best friend, Megan, about Mr. Delver's strange behavior and how worried she was she blew her review. She leaned her head against the couch, the rhythmic tapping of rain on the window lulling her into a sense of calm. Her phone buzzed, interrupting their conversation. Another call. "Rebecca." Mr. Delver's familiar voice came through, steady but strained. "I'm sorry for calling so late, but I need your help. 3 new cadavers just came in, and no one else is available. Can you come in tonight?" Rebecca hesitated, her heart sinking. The thought of returning to the mortuary filled her with dread, but she also felt a strange sense of eagerness to impress her new boss. Nervous, but excited, she agrees to come in and thanks him. As she hung up, she switched back to Megan. "Holy shit, that was him. He signed me on. He needs me to come in tonight." Megan congratulates her, and Rebecca gets out to find her keys and leave for her first shift. The mortuary, nighttime. Rebecca pulled into the gravel lot of the mortuary, the rain coming down in sheets blurring the building's stark silhouette against the dark sky. She caught the engine, the rhythmic squeak of windshield wipers fading as she sat in silence for a moment, gathering her courage. The icy rain soaked through her jacket as she dashed to the front door. The bell jingled faintly as she stepped inside, shaking off the cold. Before she could make it to the hallway, the front door locked behind her with a decisive click. Rebecca froze, turning back to the door. A dark figure loomed outside in the rain, its features obscured by the storm. Her heart raced, her breath fogging the glass as she stared. Suddenly the phone on the front desk rang, the shrill sound cutting through the stillness. Rebecca snatched it up. "Hello?" she said, her voice trembling. "Hi, Rebecca," came Mr. Delver's familiar voice. It was calm, unnervingly calm. "There's someone outside," Rebecca said quickly. "And the door, it locked behind me. What's going on?" There was a pause, the static on the line filling the silence. Then Mr. Delver spoke again, his tone as steady as ever, as he instructs Rebecca to stay calm and reveals he's the one who locked the door. "What?" Rebecca's voice rose in disbelief. This is very sudden, but listen to me carefully. He continued, ignoring her protest. We need to start right away. I'm sorry. I didn't realize until this morning that it was here, bound to you. There was no way for me to know the possession had begun. Rebecca clutched the phone tightly, anger rising in her chest. What are you talking about? Is this some kind of sick joke? It's not a joke, Mr. Delver said grimly. You're in danger, and so is anyone else who comes near you. You need to stay calm, embalm the bodies, and treat everything like a normal shift. I'll explain more as we go. Rebecca's mind reeled, her voice shaking as she demanded, Let me out of here. I can't do that, he replied. It's too dangerous, for you and for others. I'll call again when you're in the embalming room. Good luck. Rebecca stared at the phone, her pulse pounding in her ears. This has to be some kind of hazing, she muttered, trying to convince herself. The creepy new girl prank. But deep down, something about Mr. Dover's voice unsettled her in a way she couldn't shake. Rebecca stepped into the embalming room, her eyes immediately drawn to the empty gurney waiting in the center. The air felt heavier here, pressing down on her like a weight. The phone on the desk rang, and she snatched it up, her frustration boiling over. Listen, I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I'm done, she snapped. I can't work like this. Rebecca, Mr. Dover's voice interrupted, unbothered by her anger. This is not a game. The only way to save yourself is to banish the demon before it fully possesses you. To do that, you'll need to uncover its name, bind it to its chosen body, and burn it in the retort. Rebecca's grip on the phone tightened. You're insane. I left you instructions, he continued, his voice devoid of emotion. There are tapes on the desk and a cabinet with the tools you'll need. Listen to the tapes and do exactly as they say. I won't be calling again. The phones can't be trusted. Wait, Rebecca began, but the line clicked, and the silence on the other end told her he was gone. Her eyes fell on the cabinet he had mentioned. With shaking hands, she used the key left for her to unlock it. The doors creaked open, revealing an array of objects that looked like they belonged in a witch's apothecary. Runes etched into wood, bottles of strange liquid, and paper strips covered in arcane symbols. Yeah, screw this, Rebecca muttered, slamming the cabinet shut. She grabbed the first tape from the desk and popped it into the player. Mr. Dover's voice crackled to life. The Night Shift database contains a collection of demonic names. You'll need to match the sigils you find around the building to identify which demon is bound to you. Use the paper strips in the cabinet. They'll reveal signals when you walk near them. Once we know the name of the demon and which body is possessed, we place the mark on it and burn it in the retort. Rebecca stared at the tape player, her mind screaming at her to leave, but her body rooted in place. She grabbed the strips reluctantly, stuffing them into her pocket as she prepared to retrieve the first body. Rebecca pushed the gurney into cold storage. The hallway was dim, the fluorescent lights flickering sporadically. Crummy old building, she thought. With the chill biting through her gloves, she pushed the gurney back into the embalming room. Rebecca stood over the body, clipboard in hand. The cold fluorescent light overhead flickered once, then twice, before plunging the room into complete darkness. Her breath caught, the silence pressing down on her like a weight. Hello? She called, her voice barely above a whisper. Rebecca's heart dropped. The body was sitting up. Its head had twisted towards her, its mouth slightly ajar as if caught mid-sentence. A sudden snap of lightning illuminated the room for the briefest of moments. Rebecca bolted from the embalming room, her footsteps echoing through the empty hall. The cold air bit at her skin as she reached the front door. As thunder rolled in the distance, a low, guttural whisper filled the room. Don't leave. It's fine. Everything's fine. The voice was so close as if it were coiling around her, invading her thoughts. She shook her head, squeezing her eyes shut. It's not real. I'm just seeing things, she murmured to herself, clinging to the illusion of control. But the whispers persisted, weaving into her thoughts. Slowly, as if guided by some unseen force, her own voice began to echo the words. It's fine. Everything's fine. Desperation surged through her veins as she sprinted to her car, the rain soaking her to the bone. Rebecca slid into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut. Her hands trembled as she jammed the key into the ignition, twisting it frantically. Click, click. The engine groaned out, but refused to start. Come on, she yelled, hitting the steering wheel. Her chest heaved as she glanced back at the mortuary. The front doors hung wide open, their dark interior yawning like a mouth waiting to swallow her whole. And in the doorway stood a shadowed figure, unmoving, its presence radiating malevolence. The whispers returned, louder this time, filling the car with their insidious cadence. What are you doing? This is ridiculous. It's your fault. Get back to work. Rebecca's hand froze on the ignition, her mind clouding under the weight of the words. She felt her lips move, her own voice repeating them softly. It's my fault. I need to get back to work. She clenched her fists, the cool metal of her keys digging into her palm. Forcing herself out of the car, Rebecca sprinted back to the mortuary. Rain pelted her skin as she crossed the threshold, the door slamming shut behind her. Inside, the air was colder than before, the whispers fading into silence. Her resolve wavered, but she forced herself to breathe deeply, muttering under her breath, "Just get through this. Finish the shift and I'm gone." With that, Rebecca squared her shoulders and made her way back to the embalming room, the oppressive weight of the mortuary closing in around her. The first sigil. Rebecca clenched her teeth, forcing herself to focus as she continued examining the body. The clipboard in her hands felt heavier with every notation she made, each identifying mark another reminder of the lifeless form before her. The silence was far from comforting. Strange sounds echoed through the building. Knocks on distant doors, the soft metallic click of mortuary fridge doors opening and closing on their own. Rebecca glanced over her shoulder, her heart hammering in her chest, but the room remained still. "Just keep going," she muttered under her breath, returning her focus to the task. After finishing her inspection, Rebecca printed out the report. The printer's rhythmic whir was oddly soothing, filling the space with a mechanical certainty. But as she grabbed the paper and made her way to the front desk, the strip of paper that she had tucked into her pocket began to heat up. She stopped, pulling it out with trembling fingers. The strip ignited in a small but fierce flame, forcing her to drop it. The fire died almost instantly, leaving behind a glowing sigil burned into the table at her feet. Rebecca stared, her breath catching in her throat. The sigil pulsed faintly, an eerie red glow emanating from its jagged edges. Rebecca fumbled for her notepad, quickly sketching the mark before it could fade. She turned toward the cabinet, comparing the sigil to the chart inside. Though she didn't fully understand what she was looking at, she knew this was the first piece of a horrifying puzzle. The Crying Woman. Rebecca forced herself to carry on with the embalming process, carefully mixing the chemicals and gathering the tools she needed. but her mind kept drifting to the sigil and the unshakable sense that she wasn't alone. She wiped her brow, the sterile smell of the mortuary mingling with the sharp tang of embalming fluid. The gurney wheel squeaked as she moved the body, the sound echoing unnaturally in the quiet room. Then she heard it. Faint sobbing. Rebecca froze, her breath hitching. The sound was soft at first, coming from the direction of the hallway. It grew louder with every second, echoing through the building, until it felt like it was all around her. The sobbing led her to the bathroom door. A woman stood in front of the mirror, her back against the wall. Her long, dark hair hung limply around her face, her shoulders trembling with each anguished sob. "Will you help me?" the woman whispered, her voice barely audible, yet it sent a chill down Rebecca's spine. Rebecca took a step back, her body tense. The woman's limbs began to jerk and twist, each movement accompanied by the grotesque sound of bones snapping. She backed against the wall, pointing at the mirror. Rebecca's gaze followed the trembling hand. On the mirror was an old, faded photograph. She stepped closer, her breath fogging the glass as she squinted at the image. It was a photo of the mortuary, unchanged despite the sepia tone of the picture. Beneath it, written in spidery handwriting, were the words 1970, the year of arrival of the House of Death, the birth of its creator. The full number shall be 6. When she looked back at the woman, she was gone. The bathroom lights flickered once more, before returning to their usual sterile glow. The room was empty, the sobbing silenced. Rebecca stumbled back into the hallway, clutching the photograph tightly. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of what she'd seen. "Get it together," she whispered to herself, forcing her legs to move. "Just finish the shift." But deep down, she knew she wasn't alone in the building. As Rebecca finished embalming the first body, the paper strip in her pocket grew warm. She pulled it out, holding it tightly as she moved through the room. The paper burst into flames, revealing another sigil scorched into the plaster. Rebecca stumbled back, her breath coming in quick gasps. She jotted the new sigil onto her notepad, her mind spinning. "This can't be happening," she muttered, but the evidence was irrefutable. The cabinet loomed in the corner, its contents now less ridiculous and more terrifying. Rebecca opened it, comparing the 2 sigils she had found to the chart inside. The demon's name was beginning to take shape. The Bloody Vision. Rebecca's hands moved methodically, each action deliberate as she tried to block out the strange occurrences around her. The whispers, the sigil, the woman in the bathroom. She pushed them to the back of her mind, focusing on the body before her. But her focus shattered as a cold drip landed on the body before her. She froze, staring at the small red bead. Slowly, she tilted her head upward. The ceiling above was cracked and warped, and from the largest fracture, blood trickled down in thin, steady streams. Her stomach churned as the drip, drip, drip filled her ears. Then something moved. A pale, bloodied arm emerged from a gaping hole in the ceiling tiles. The ceiling collapsed entirely, plunging her into darkness. When Rebecca opened her eyes, she was no longer in the embalming room. She stood in a dark, windowless space, the air heavy and damp. The faint metallic scent of blood clung to her nostrils. The floor was littered with old, crumpled papers, each one scrawled with symbols and incoherent phrases. The only source of light was a flickering bulb suspended from the ceiling, casting long, shifting shadows across the room. At the far end, a body hung suspended by chains. blood pooling into a rusted metal bucket underneath. On an empty bookshelf beside the body, a single cassette tape rested. It's labeled faded and illegible. Rebecca hesitated, then picked it up and inserted it into the player. Mr. Delver's voice crackled to life, calm and measured but distorted. Rebecca's gaze shifted to the bucket beneath the body. She approached it cautiously, her shoes sticking slightly to the blood-slick floor. Inside, submerged in the thick dark liquid, was a small reagent bottle, like those in the cabinet. Beside the bucket, leaning against the wall, was a strange wooden coffin, and above it was a message that read EST- and 4 empty spaces and the numbers 44. Suddenly a familiar voice cut through the silence. "What are you doing here?" Her heart raced as she looked down at her hands. They were trembling but clean, free of blood. She glanced around the bathroom, everything eerily still as though she'd never left. A faint glow caught her attention as she stepped into the back room. On the wall of the cold storage unit, a third rune had burned itself into the metal, its jagged lines glowing faintly. Rebecca exhaled shakily, her mind reeling from the vision she just endured. She pulled out her notepad, her fingers unsteady as she copied the rune. "This is the third one," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's almost complete." As she turned towards the embalming room to access the night shift database. There, squatting low behind the drawers, was a grotesque figure. Its skin was bone white, stretched tight over an angular frame. Suddenly it vanished into the walls. Her heart pounded, but she forced herself to focus. Rebecca sat at the desk, the glow of the computer screen casting harsh shadows across her face. The night shift database hummed to life as she entered the runes she had discovered. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly as she matched each sigil to its demonic counterpart. Using the 3 sigils she had, she deciphered the missing 4th. The name appeared on the screen: Sebos, of the House of Immolation. Her throat tightened as she read the name out loud in a whisper. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows deeper, as though the entity had heard her recognition and was drawing closer. "It knows. It knows I know," she thought, her breath quickening. The confrontation. Determined to finish the job, Rebecca wheeled the second embalmed body back into the embalming room. Her instincts told her this was the one, the demon's vessel. Rebecca affixed the mark to the body's chest, the metal plate sinking slightly into the pale flesh. She stared at it, her mind racing as she wheeled the gurney toward the retort room. Then came the voice. "Are you sure this is the right one?" Rebecca's grip on the gurney tightened, her knuckles turning white under the gloves. Doubt clawed at her mind, the demon's words sowing seeds of fear and hesitation. She pushed forward, her resolve hardening with every step. Rebecca positioned the gurney in front of the retort, her hands shaking as she slid the body inside. The steel door groaned as it shut. She flipped the switch. The retort roared to life, flames licking hungrily at the body within. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of the fire. Then came the banging. It started as faint thudding, like fists pounding against the steel door from the inside. The banging grew louder, more violent, until the entire retort shook. The steel warped under the pressure, and then, with a deafening boom, the door blasted open. Rebecca was thrown against the wall, the gurney clattering to the floor beside her. Through the haze, she saw it, a charred, blackened figure crawling out of the retort. Its limbs were twisted, its movements jerky and unnatural, as if it were learning to move all over again. Its eyes burned with an otherworldly light as it locked onto Rebecca. The creature lunged towards her, its molten body leaving streaks of ash and embers in its wake. Rebecca pressed herself against the wall, her body trembling. Just as the demon reached her, an unseen force yanked it backwards. The entity screamed, clawing at the air as it was dragged into the roaring flames. Rebecca awoke on the embalming room floor, the cold tiles pressing against her cheek. Her entire body ached as she slowly sat up, her surroundings bathed in the pale orange glow of dawn. "Is it over?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "It's never over," came a familiar voice. Rebecca turned to see Mr. Delver standing in the doorway, his expression grim. "You survived," he said simply. Tears welled in Rebecca's eyes as she rose to her feet, her legs shaking beneath her. "I don't want this, I just want to go home," she pleaded. Mr. Delver shook his head. "You can leave, but once an entity finds you, it doesn't let go. All the houses of hell will do anything to claim you now. From this moment on, there's always a chance this will happen again." Rebecca's voice cracked as she sobbed. "I didn't ask for this. I don't want this." "I know," Mr. Delver said softly, his tone almost apologetic. "But now you have a choice. Work the night shift. Learn what I know. Give yourself a chance to survive." He hesitated, his next words heavy with meaning. "You're the first person I've ever seen survive something like this." Rebecca stared at him, her tear-streaked face pale and exhausted. "The choice is yours," he continued, stepping aside to let her leave. "I hope you come back." Rebecca hesitated, her eyes darting to the sunlight streaming through the front door. Freedom was just steps away, but something inside her stirred. A cold, sinking realization that this was her life now. From behind her, the embalming room door creaked shut. Well, Nightstalkers, it seems that Rebecca's nightmare is finally over. For now. But there's always another shadow to be explored, another nightmare waiting to be unearthed. And pretty soon, she'll have to cover another shift. If you've enjoyed tonight's descent into the macabre, don't forget to like this video. Show it some love so I know you're ready for more. Subscribe to join our little coven and hit that bell icon so you never miss an episode. Next time, we'll be covering Rebecca's second shift. Will she survive, or will she succumb? If you're brave enough, follow me across the web for even more nightmares. As always, from my dark corner of the web to yours, farewell, Nightstalkers. Until the next nightmare.